welcome to yet another edition of an interview with me, Joel Outscoon. Well, we usually talk about the world outside, that is politics, business matters and all that. But today we thought we need to talk about something which is very important, that is our health, because they say health is wealth, and something that we pay least attention to with the busy surroundings that we live in. So we thought that on this very special interview, we need to focus on our health. Because as I mentioned, health is wealth, and we need to manage our health because we human beings live a very busy life and we give least concern to our health. So today on our interview, we have with us two prominent personalities here in this industry, and that's none other than Professor Sanath Lamabadusuriya, who is no stranger here in Sri Lanka and a renowned pediatrician. Welcome and nice to have you with us on our segment today.
Thank you very much.
And also joining us today is all the way from Canada, Toronto, Professor Olivieri. Nice to have you two with us on our special edition of this interview. So I would like to ask, it's, as I mentioned, business and politics is all what we talk about most of the time, but we give least attention to health-related matters, and we talk less about the importance of health. Professor, let me start off with you. Well, in Sri Lanka, I would like to ask you, what are the health factors that we need to be concerned?
I think I can talk about the health in children in general. Now, during the last few decades, I think the diseases that affect children, there have been a change. In the past, in the 1950s, 60s and 70s, communicable diseases, that various infections due to bacteria and viruses used to affect children in large numbers, and it accounted for their deaths as well as for their morbidity or illness. But now, with excellent coverage of our immunization program, where we have more than 99% coverage, infectious diseases like diphtheria, measles, whooping cough, poliomyelitis have become extremely rare. And we are left with other diseases. And one of the diseases where I have been interested in over the years is an inherited disease which affects children, and that's called thalassemia.
Thalassemia is what you say is of your interest to speak about today.
Yes.
I'll cross over to you and ask you. Professor just spoke about the Sri Lankan context. If you take it in a global context, what are the sicknesses or what health issues are people facing these days?
Well, if you do want to focus on thalassemia, it's important to remember that we think of some diseases as very common, especially North America and Europe. But if you look at thalassemia, it is one of the two most common single gene disorders in the world. The other one being sickle cell anemia, which is common in Africa. So people discuss, that rare disease that you manage, thalassemia, it must be very interesting to manage a rare disease. This is not rare at all. It's very common worldwide. Happens to be very common in Sri Lanka as well, but it's very common worldwide. And it was estimated that by the year 2000, 1 in 7 of the world's population would carry one of those genes. So that means it's an enormously significant global health problem.
Let me cross over to you, Professor, and ask you, would you like to give our audience a brief explanation as to what this thalassemia disease means?
Right. Now, as Professor Nancy Olivieri said, it's a single gene defect. It's an inherited disease which you can get from your parents if they are carriers. Now, the normal lifespan of a red cell is 120 days. In other words, it's about 4 months. Now, if you have the thalassemia disease or thalassemia major or beta thalassemia major, then the lifespan of a red cell is very much shorter. It doesn't last so long and it is destroyed. Now, you know that red cells are important to carry oxygen to the tissues. So when the red cells are destroyed, to keep the patient alive, we had to give frequent blood transfusions. Now, frequent blood transfusions will help to improve the anemia, but it has its problems because blood contains iron. And when you give repeated blood transfusions, about 1 per month, then iron accumulates in the body. And iron is toxic to most of the organs in the body. Excess iron gets deposited in the liver, it gets deposited in the heart, it gets deposited in the pancreas and various other endocrine organs. So then, unless you do something to get rid of that excess iron, the patient is not going to live long. And therefore, we have to use what are called chelating agents. These are medications that when given either by injection as an infusion or given orally as tablets, combine with the iron and is excreted in the urine. And that has to be given lifelong. So in other words, if you are born with thalassemia, to keep the patient alive, we have to give blood transfusions. Then, when you give blood transfusions, then you have to give chelating agents to get rid of the iron. So that's the way, and it's a lifelong problem. So as long as the patient lives, we have to keep on doing this.
Professor Nancy, would you like to add anything to what Professor mentioned? Professor
Well, no, it's an excellent outline of what we are facing in a child. So a child comes to you as a baby, usually about 3 to 6 months, very anemic. The parents are understandably upset. The child usually needs to be transfused. And about a year or two from then, the iron has begun to accumulate. We know it's going to accumulate, but we can't give drugs very, very early. So we need to give them after 12 or 15 transfusions. And once the transfusions set in and they're a regimen that the patient needs to follow, they also need to start on another difficult regimen. So here's a patient who's already facing monthly blood transfusions, now has to go on daily treatment. So that is very difficult because not only are the parents managing the monthly blood visits to hospital, but they're managing a daily regimen at home. And it used to be needles. It used to be into the skin, taped into the skin 12 hours a night. And in many patients, that's still the regimen. In the last 10 or 15 years, there has been another drug that's come effectively to Sri Lanka. It's managed well. It's in a pill form, and it's easier to take, but it's still chronic daily therapy. And you know and I know how difficult it is to take therapy for 1 week or 10 days if we've got an infection. So we need to remember that this is a very onerous task for children and their parents, mainly their parents, until they reach adolescence. So you've got a situation which has it's a very important disease because the treatment is so complicated.
Well, you said this treatment is very complicated. Well, let's head into a short commercial break, and we'll have more on explaining this disease, which is a disease to be thoughtful, and we should be mindful about this disease. So more of this comes after this short commercial break. Welcome back to the interview. Well, we were just having a conversation about this disease which we Sri Lankans and the world over should be mindful about, which is thalassemia. Well, we're in conversation with Professor Lamabadusuriya, and also we have with us Professor Nancy Olivieri, all the way from Canada. So we just, before going to the commercial break, we were creating awareness as to what this disease is. So I would like to ask you, Professor, why, as Sri Lankans, why should we be concerned about this disease?
We should be concerned because if you get the disease, if you are born with the disease, it's a lifelong problem. And unless there are interventions, then your lifespan is shortened drastically. And at the moment, at present, our government, through the Ministry of Health, provides free health care for thalassaemic patients. The blood transfusions are given free of charge. The chelating agents are given free of charge. And the annual expenditure is estimated to be about $2 million. And it's about 5% of the total health budget. So therefore, I think it is important for us to try and prevent babies being born with this disease. And there are ways of doing it, because if you do particular blood tests, you can find out whether you are a carrier of the disease. Now, a person who is a carrier of the disease won't exhibit any symptoms or signs at all. He leads a perfectly normal life. But of course, if a carrier of thalassemia, beta thalassemia major, marries another person with beta thalassemia major who is a carrier, then there is a 25% chance of a child being born with the disease, and that is beta thalassemia major. And there are simple blood tests and also not so simple blood tests to identify carriers. And in some areas, now in Sri Lanka, thalassemia is more prevalent in two provinces, that is the North Central province and the North Western province. And there is a probable reason for thalassemia to be prevalent in these two provinces. Because in the 1930s, when there were epidemics of malaria used to be common in these two provinces. So the probable reason is malaria parasite could not live long enough in patients with thalassemia or thalassemia carriers. And so malaria killed members of the normal population, but spared those who were patients with thalassemia or who were carriers of thalassemia. And that's a probable reason why thalassemia is more prevalent in those two provinces. So now we can screen, for instance, if we have a patient with thalassemia, we can do what is called cascade screening. That is to test the blood of the brothers and sisters, the first cousins, and see whether they are carriers. And that has been done in some parts of Sri Lanka, and then we issue them a card after doing these blood tests. We give a green card if they are not a carrier, and if they are a carrier, we give a pink card. And then they are counseled. They are told that one day when they get married, after checking the horoscopes, depending on your culture and your beliefs, then one should check on the status of thalassemia. And we discourage two carriers from getting married and having children, because there's a risk of a child with thalassemia being born.
So that's indeed something stunning, because if you're a perfect match, and according to you, you say concerning marriage, if it's a perfect match even, but if they're affected with this disease, that means that is a question mark as to whether they should get married.
That's right.
Well, a disease is also something that could avoid a marriage.
Well, on the other hand, they could get married, but adopt a child, not have children of their own, because of the risk of thalassemia. If they sort of insist on getting married, you see. The problem is that if they have children, then there's a 25% chance of a child with beta thalassemia major being born.
So, Professor, now you just mentioned that there's a 25% chance of a child being born with this disease.
Yeah.
For you to mention all this, I would like to cross over to you, Professor, and ask you, why is this disease, is it a deadly disease? Would you like to create awareness about that?
I'd like to say that the important thing is it is quite serious. It can be treated, as we've said, but if you had the choice of having a child with this disease, wherein you have to treat every month, every day, worry, and it doesn't end after 2 years or 5 years or 10 years, it's always a worry. The reason to think about it seriously is to think, oh, do I carry that gene? And I am sure there are many Sri Lankans, as there are Canadians, who say, oh, well, I had the blood test, because they've had a blood test. But that's not necessarily the right blood test. Have you had a blood test, for example, for thalassemia? You?
No.
You don't know.
No.
Maybe you have, maybe you haven't, but you're not sure of your status. The important thing is to know your status, because when you get married, you would like your partner's status to be known. As Prof has said, 1 out of 4 children at every pregnancy may be affected. So that means that after you have 1 child, you may still have 5 others. We had families in Canada with 5 children with thalassemia major because they had bad luck on every pregnancy. So that's what's important. The children that we have now in this country are well treated thanks to the excellent system of health here. They're well treated in Canada. They're not so well treated worldwide, but they're well treated in Sri Lanka. But the important thing is prevention. To know your status, to link up with somebody who is not a carrier if you are a carrier. That's the important way to prevent the births. And while everyone values these children, it is a very difficult life for their parents and for them. So, as Prof says, we really need to make that aware to the citizens of Sri Lanka.
There is another way of preventing the birth of such children, because when a carrier is pregnant, one can do some tests to find out whether the fetus is affected or not. And in some countries where they do these tests, if the fetus is affected, the laws of that country allow a termination of pregnancy. Now, our laws for termination of pregnancy are outdated. They belong to a couple of centuries ago. And our laws do not allow a termination of a pregnancy even if it is diagnosed that the fetus has beta thalassemia major. So that is not an option for our preventive programs. So our only way is to identify carriers and then discourage them from getting married and having children.
So, Professor, do you mean to say that the relevant authorities are not taking enough measures to prevent this disease spreading in Sri Lanka?
No, the government is doing that. I think they have released funds.
Okay.
Now, for instance, now I am currently doing some work in Anuradhapura, and the Minister of Health has given funds to start screening programs of the community there. And in the next few months, we are going to start a screening program. We will be visiting schools and we will be counseling them. Before any sort of screening program, we have to counsel them. I think we have to inform the school children why we are doing these tests. We have to inform the parents. Then only they will give consent for these screening programs. And when they are convinced that it's a benefit for them, then of course they will give their consent to be screened for thalassemia.
Yeah, because even I don't see that much awareness is being created on this disease, because I myself was stunned to know that there is something, such kind of a deadly disease, I would call it that, because it's stunning to hear this data coming out from the two of you. Yeah. And I'm sure our audience too is wondering as to what this is. Well, I would like to ask you, as in a global context, what do you think about this whole thing? But before that, we'll head into a short commercial break, and we'll be in conversation with these two professors who are here with us to share insightful facts. How do you see this whole picture? And also I would like to twist my question and ask you, is Sri Lanka giving the necessary attention towards this disease?
Well, I actually come from Canada, where it has a large population of patients with thalassemia, but by no means anything close to those in Asia. And when I first came 20 years ago, it was clear that much of the care was excellent. In fact, we think of it as the jewel of Asia, because the patients are provided with free care, free medicine. Expertise is always a problem the world over. There are small numbers of experts in every country with this disease. The survival rates here, so when we came in 1995, I came with a gentleman named Professor Sir David Weatherall, who is the Regius Professor of Medicine Emeritus at the University of Oxford. The Weatherall Institute of Molecular Medicine is named for David Weatherall, and he was the person who became very interested in thalassemia early in his career and described many of the important findings worldwide. And a lot of the advances of thalassemia are due directly to his work. And working with him in Sri Lanka, we've always noted that the island has a number of, I'm sitting beside one of them, experts who manages the disease in an optimal way. But this disease is difficult to manage. For example, we have close by countries that have no care for these patients. India recently began to provide free chelation in the last 18 months to these patients. Sri Lanka has done that for 30 years. So the patients here are, by contrast to the countries around Asia, and to some extent in Europe and the Middle East, much better off. Thanks both to the care and thanks to the health care here, which is a wonderful public health care system. But again, it's a difficult disease. We are faced with a lifelong problem of treatment. And as I've mentioned, both of us have mentioned, screening and prevention is the key to reducing the burden of health on this country.
Professor, you are a leading pediatrician here in Sri Lanka. Well, do you think Sri Lanka is going the right direction in curing, or maybe the direct attention is given towards this disease?
Yes, I think where treatment of such patients are concerned, I think we are doing our best. Now, if a baby is born with beta thalassemia major, and is not given any blood transfusions at all, that child is likely to survive only for about 5 or 6 years. If that patient is given blood transfusion without any iron chelating drugs, that patient will probably live for until say about 13 or 14 years. And in thalassemia, invariably, their liver and spleen are enlarged. And these are sort of cases that you get for your final MBBS exam. So the students are very familiar with it. And questions are often set about thalassemia. So they are made aware. So the medical students are made quite aware. Then they become doctors, they see such patients. And of course, if one is trained as a pediatrician in Sri Lanka, you get a thorough training in the management of thalassemia. So wherever thalassemics live, I think they get excellent care in Sri Lanka.
Well, Professor Nancy, I would give you a couple of minutes to briefly explain. You're based in Canada. Well, what is your contribution towards curing or treating this disease?
Well, I've been involved in thalassemia work for about 30 years now, but my main involvement with Sri Lanka came in about 1995. We began to come to the island to look after a form of thalassemia that is poorly understood. It's probably still poorly understood, but we then formed a charity called Hemoglobal in 2003. And Hemoglobal, combination of hemoglobin and global, tries to elevate the level of care of patients with thalassemia in Asia, but particularly in Sri Lanka. Our job is much easier here. We try to help. We try to contribute to research projects to elevate the overall effective care. So I made a number of visits over the years, about 70 visits to Sri Lanka, and 2 other visits besides this visit this year, interacting with the physicians here, with the young people, and mainly with the patients to see what we can understand best about this disease and try to advance its care and its understanding.
Professor, finally I would like to ask you, well, there is a message that you would like to give out to the community here in Sri Lanka and around the world who is watching you today and watching you as well, Professor. I would like to direct this question to you. What would that simple message be?
The simple message is, I think, if you have a relative, even a distant relative, who is having thalassemia disease, that's beta thalassemia major, or any form of thalassemia, or who is a carrier of thalassemia, I think it is best for you to get your blood tested. First, initially a full blood count, another test called hemoglobin electrophoresis, which can be done in most laboratories, and get your thalassemia status evaluated and find out whether you are a carrier or not. Then, of course, if you are a carrier and when you are getting married, it's best to avoid getting married to another thalassemia carrier. Now, one thing that cannot be mentioned so far is you spoke about a cure for thalassemia. Well, there is a cure, and that's bone marrow transplantation, which is in its infancy in Sri Lanka. So far, 9 patients have had bone marrow transplantations done, 9 patients with thalassemia in the private sector. It costs millions of rupees. But the Ministry of Health is very concerned about it, and they are in the process of setting up facilities at Lade Ridgeway Hospital to provide that facility. So very soon, I think starting from next year, we will be able to do bone marrow transplantations in some patients with beta thalassemia major.
Well, that's indeed good news for all Sri Lankans, because the government is taking all necessary steps to help prevent and cure this disease here in Sri Lanka. Well, on that note, let me take a special word of thanks to the two of you for joining us here on our special interview and creating awareness to the entire nation and world over on this deadly disease.
Thank you.
Deadly disease, I would say. And also, I was stunned by the revelations that you two made on our show. And thank you very much, Professor Nancy Olivieri,
thank you very much.
Joining us on our segment today. And also Professor, well-known pediatrician, Professor Lamabadusuriya, for joining us on our segment.
Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure. Well, the message has been passed out to you, and I'm sure if you watched our interview, you would have got an insightful fact. So don't wait another second. Rush to the nearest lab and get yourself tested, because prevention is better. And because I mentioned health is wealth, so you need to take care of your health, because it is your responsibility to take care of yourself and no one else's responsibility. The message has been passed by these two renowned professors. It's up to you. Take the task today and do it yourself. All the very best. Join us again next time with another interview.